Iron Bottom Sound didn't get its name from a poet. Sailors gave it that name themselves. After 4 brutal months in 1942, turned the narrow channel off Guadalcanal into a graveyard for over 50 ships. The U.S. Navy arrived here in August with a peacetime rule book. Daylight gunnery drills, cautious formations, radar nobody fully trusted yet. The Imperial Japanese Navy arrived with something the Americans didn't have: a decade of live-fire night combat training and torpedoes built to run faster and hit harder than anything in the U.S. arsenal. On the night of August 9th, that gap cost the Allies 4 heavy cruisers in about 32 minutes, the worst single defeat in U.S. Navy history. What happened over the next 14 weeks wasn't a lucky recovery. It was a doctrine rebuilt in real time, under fire, by officers who had no choice but to learn faster than the enemy could kill them.
The island that wasn't the point. Guadalcanal was never really about Guadalcanal. It was about 6,000 feet of cleared coral and dirt on its northern coast, an airstrip the Japanese had started building in June 1942, and the Americans seized unfinished on August 7th. Marines renamed it Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway, and from that moment the entire campaign turned into a fight over a single question: whose planes would fly from it, and whose ships could protect the men flying them. That question had a strange, brutal answer. Daylight belonged to the Americans. Once the sun was up, Henderson Field's fighters and dive bombers owned the sky over the Sound, and no Japanese warship wanted to be caught on the surface under them. But night was a different war entirely. American aircraft couldn't operate after dark, and that meant the water around Guadalcanal, later nicknamed the Slot by the sailors who ran it, became every evening a corridor Japan could use almost freely. The Japanese called it the Tokyo Express, destroyers and cruisers slipping down through the Solomon Islands after dusk, running reinforcements and supplies into Guadalcanal, then withdrawing before daylight brought the American planes back. If the U.S. Navy couldn't stop those runs, Japan could resupply its garrison indefinitely, and Henderson Field would stay under siege forever. So the campaign split cleanly in two. Above the waterline and in daylight, this was a Marine Corps and Army Air Forces fight for an airstrip. Below the waterline and after dark, it was a U.S. Navy fight for control of a 9-mile channel, one that would ultimately cost more ships than any other naval campaign of the Pacific War. Whoever controlled the Sound after dark controlled how long the battle for the island itself could last. That's the fight this documentary is really about.
A Navy trained for the wrong war. Walk into an American gunnery drill in early 1942, and you'd see a Navy built around one assumption: the fleet that spots the enemy first, at the longest range, in daylight, wins. Radar was new, and nobody had fully worked out how to trust it yet. Standard doctrine still leaned on visual spotting and searchlights, with radar treated as a backup instrument rather than the primary sensor it would eventually become. Night engagements were considered rare, risky, and something to avoid rather than something to master. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the better part of a decade preparing for exactly the opposite. Japanese doctrine assumed that a smaller fleet fighting a larger one would need every advantage darkness could offer, and their crews trained relentlessly for it. Blackout maneuvers, night optics, and gunnery drills conducted specifically without the benefit of daylight visibility. Japanese lookouts were trained to pick out ship silhouettes against faint horizon light with a precision American crews simply hadn't practiced. Then there was the torpedo. The Type 93, which American sailors would later nickname the Long Lance, ran on pure oxygen instead of compressed air, giving it a longer range, higher speed, and a far larger warhead than anything in the U.S. arsenal, and almost no wake to give away its launch. American commanders for much of 1942 didn't fully grasp what that weapon could do at ranges they assumed were safe. Cruisers steamed in tight, predictable formations, well within long lance range, believing themselves out of danger. None of this was secret, exactly. It was simply untested. The U.S. Navy had spent 20 years wargaming a daylight battleship clash in the open Pacific. What it got instead was a knife fight in a 9-mile channel at night against an enemy who'd been rehearsing for this specific kind of fight since before the war began. That mismatch is what made Savo Island possible.
Savo Island, 32 minutes. Just after midnight on August 9, 1942, 5 Allied cruisers and several destroyers were screening the transport ships still unloading off Guadalcanal, split into separate patrol groups north and south of Savo Island. It was raining intermittently, visibility was poor, and the American and Australian crews had been at general quarters for days straight, running on exhaustion. At 1:43 a.m., a Japanese force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer, commanded by Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, slipped past a picket destroyer without being detected and bore down on the southern group first. American lookouts spotted the Japanese ships only minutes before the shooting started. Some accounts describe confusion over whether the approaching silhouettes were friendly. By the time general quarters alarms were fully answered, Japanese searchlights had already locked on to their targets, and gunfire was landing. The cruiser USS Astoria took hits within moments of opening fire and was burning uncontrollably within 20 minutes. USS Quincy was caught almost broadside, hit by gunfire and at least 2 torpedoes, and rolled over and sank before most of her crew could escape the lower decks. USS Vincennes suffered a similar fate, struck repeatedly, set ablaze, and sunk within the same brutal stretch of time. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, in the same engagement, was reduced to a wreck and later scuttled. By roughly 2:15 a.m., barely half an hour after the first shots, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk or sinking, and over 1,000 sailors were dead or dying in the water. Mikawa's force, remarkably, withdrew without pressing the attack on the vulnerable transport ships still anchored offshore, a decision that would spare Guadalcanal's invasion force from potential catastrophe, but did nothing to soften what had just happened to the Navy's screening force. Savo Island remains, to this day, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history, and it happened in less time than it takes to watch this documentary's first act. The Reckoning. The Navy didn't bury Savo Island. It investigated it, and the findings were uncomfortable in ways that went well beyond bad luck. A formal board of inquiry, convened in the weeks after the battle, worked to reconstruct exactly how a numerically comparable force had been overwhelmed so completely and so fast. What emerged wasn't a single failure, it was a chain of them. Radar operators aboard the picket destroyers had picked up contacts, but the information hadn't been relayed with enough urgency up the chain of command. Communication between the northern and southern cruiser groups was poor enough that the southern force was essentially destroyed before the northern force fully understood an engagement was underway. Crews had been at general quarters for days and were worn down exactly when sharp reflexes mattered most. And the deeper issue, the one that took longer to admit, was that American commanders had gone into the fight without a real appreciation for how capable Japanese night combat doctrine actually was. The findings didn't stay locked in a report. They forced a visible shift in how the Pacific Fleet operated in the months that followed. Radar contacts got treated as primary information rather than something to be visually confirmed before acting on. Task force commanders began running dedicated night combat drills, something that had barely existed in American training before Guadalcanal. Formations were adjusted so that a single surprise contact couldn't cripple an entire screening line at once. None of that undid what happened in Iron Bottom Sound on August 9th, but it marked the moment the U.S. Navy stopped treating its pre-war assumptions as settled and started rebuilding its playbook while still in the fight, a process that would be tested again and again in the engagements still to come in that same stretch of water.
Relearning in the dark. Doctrine doesn't rewrite itself in a classroom. It gets rewritten in engagements nobody remembers as clearly as Savo Island, fought by crews applying lessons that were barely a few weeks old. Through late August, September, and into October 1942, the Tokyo Express kept running, and American ships kept meeting it, messy, grinding fights that rarely made headlines but steadily reshaped how the fleet operated at night. The clearest test came on the night of 11th to 12th October off Cape Esperance. This time, American cruisers under Rear Admiral Norman Scott had drilled specifically for a night engagement, and it showed. Radar contacts were acted on immediately rather than second-guessed. Scott's force crossed the Japanese formation's T, positioning that let American guns bear on the enemy column while limiting how many Japanese guns could answer back. The result was a clear American tactical win. A Japanese cruiser and destroyer sunk for the loss of one U.S. destroyer. It wasn't a clean, mistake-free performance. Friendly fire and identification confusion still cost lives, but it was proof the adjustments from Savo Island were working. Between these larger clashes ran a constant grind of smaller ones, destroyer skirmishes, supply run interceptions, damaged ships limping back to Tulagi for repairs under makeshift conditions. Crews learned to trust radar readings over visual impressions in poor visibility. Commanders learned to keep formations tighter and communications simpler, cutting down the confusion that had doomed the Southern Group at Savo. None of it was doctrine handed down from Washington. It was doctrine built by officers making corrections after nearly every engagement, because the alternative was repeating August 9th. By mid-October, the U.S. Navy fighting in the slot wasn't the same Navy that had entered it 2 months earlier. It was more cautious with radar, faster to commit to a firing solution, and far less willing to assume the Japanese wouldn't be there in the dark. That version of the fleet was about to be tested by the single worst night of close-range naval combat the U.S. Navy would face in the entire war. The night of November 12th to 13th. Nothing in the earlier fighting prepared anyone for what happened on the night of November 12th to 13th, 1942. American cruisers and destroyers screening transports off Guadalcanal ran directly into a Japanese force built around the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, ships sent in specifically to bombard Henderson Field into ruin. What followed wasn't a battle fought at gunnery range. It was fought at ranges close enough that some ships nearly collided in pitch darkness, with American cruisers firing at targets so close that their own guns couldn't depress low enough to avoid overshooting. The formation lines dissolved almost immediately. Ships lost track of who was friend and who was enemy in the dark and the smoke. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, commanding the American force from the cruiser USS San Francisco, was killed when the bridge took a direct hit. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the same commander who'd engineered the win at Cape Esperance a month earlier, was killed aboard USS Atlanta in the same chaotic engagement. 2 American admirals died in a single night, something that hadn't happened to the U.S. Navy in a single battle since the Civil War.
By the time the guns fell silent, the American Navy had lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with several more ships badly damaged. But the American force had done what it came to do. It blunted the battleship bombardment mission and left Hiei crippled enough that she was scuttled the following day, becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. It was not a clean victory by any conventional measure. It was closer to a mutual bloodletting that happened to leave Henderson Field standing. The cost was staggering, and the tactics were nothing like the careful, radar-disciplined engagement at Cape Esperance a month before. But the outcome mattered more than the method. Japan's chance to neutralize the airstrip by battleship bombardment was gone, and the fleet that absorbed this brutal night would carry its lessons into one final major engagement just days later, one that would finally show what the rebuilt doctrine could do when it worked as intended.
Turning the corner, Second Guadalcanal. 3 nights after the chaos of November 13th, the Navy got a chance to show what all those hard lessons actually amounted to. On the night of November 14th-15th, a Japanese force built around the battleship Kirishima moved down the slot again, aiming to finish what Hiei had started, a bombardment run against Henderson Field. Waiting for them was a very different American force than the one that had been shredded days earlier. The battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota, screened by 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee. Lee was, by reputation, one of the Navy's sharpest minds on radar-directed gunnery, and this engagement showed why. Rather than repeating the tangled, close-range brawl of the previous battle, Washington used radar to track Kirishima at range in the dark, building a firing solution before the Japanese force was even fully aware of the threat. South Dakota suffered serious damage during the engagement after losing power and becoming briefly illuminated by searchlights, drawing heavy fire. But Washington, operating with a clean radar picture, put multiple 16-inch shells into Kirishima in a matter of minutes. The battleship was left burning and unable to steer, and her crew scuttled her before dawn. It was the validation the Navy had been building towards since Savo Island. Radar wasn't a backup instrument anymore. It was the primary tool driving the engagement, tracked and trusted well before visual contact was even possible. The bombardment mission against Henderson Field failed. The Tokyo Express run that night was turned back with heavy losses, and for the first time in the campaign, an American commander had taken a Japanese battleship out of a night action largely on his own terms, using exactly the doctrine that 3 months of brutal, costly trial and error had built. Second Guadalcanal didn't end the fighting in the slot, but it marked the moment the balance of skill in these night engagements had genuinely shifted, and it set the tone for the U.S. Navy's approach to the rest of the Pacific War.
The numbers nobody talks about. Say Guadalcanal, and most people pictured jungle fighting, not warships. But the naval engagements fought in that 9-mile channel between August and December 1942 cost both sides a staggering number of ships, enough that sailors started calling it Iron Bottom Sound before the campaign was even over, and the name stuck permanently. By the time the fighting wound down, the U.S. Navy and its allies had lost roughly 24 major warships in the surrounding waters, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, along with thousands of sailors, many of whom went down with their ships in engagements that lasted only minutes. Rear Admirals Callahan and Scott are only the most senior names among a casualty list that ran into the thousands, spanning enlisted sailors barely out of training to officers with decades of service. What makes Iron Bottom Sound remarkable isn't just the scale of the losses, it's the compressed time frame. Roughly 4 months, a handful of engagements, several of them lasting less than an hour apiece.
And in that short, brutal stretch of water, an entire navy relearned how it fought at night, at a cost that's easy to state in numbers, but much harder to fully absorb. From Iron Bottom Sound to the rest of the Pacific, the lessons paid for in Iron Bottom Sound didn't stay there. What started as desperate ship-by-ship improvisation in the fall of 1942 hardened over the following 2 years into standard doctrine across the entire Pacific Fleet. Radar-directed gunnery, treated as an unproven backup at Savo Island, became the default method for tracking and engaging targets in low visibility, taught and drilled fleet-wide rather than relearned unit by unit. Task force organization changed, too. Commanders who watched formations dissolve into confusion in the dark built clearer standing procedures for night engagements, simplified communication protocols, pre-designated firing responsibilities, and drills specifically built around low-visibility combat rather than treating it as a rare exception to daylight doctrine. That shift showed up clearly by the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, particularly in the night engagement at Surigao Strait, where American battleships, several of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, used radar-directed fire to devastating effect against a Japanese force in conditions that echoed almost exactly the kind of fight that had once caught the Navy unprepared off Guadalcanal. The difference in outcome wasn't luck. It was 2 years of doctrine built directly on what had been learned at enormous cost in the slot. It's a pattern worth sitting with. The U.S. Navy that fought the last major surface battles of the Pacific War was, in a very direct sense, shaped by the worst defeat of its war. Savo Island didn't just cost 4 cruisers and over 1,000 lives. It forced a rebuild that ultimately made the fleet far more dangerous than it had been before that first brutal night.
What the Sound still holds. Iron Bottom Sound is still there, off the northern coast of Guadalcanal, and so are the ships. Wreck diving expeditions and deep-sea surveys over the decades have located and documented many of the vessels lost during those 4 months. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships resting largely intact in deep water, effectively untouched since the nights they went down. For historians and veterans' families, these surveys have done something written records alone couldn't. They've confirmed exactly where certain ships met their end, and in some cases corrected decades-old uncertainty about a vessel's final position. For the sailors who survived these engagements, the memory never really faded into abstraction. Oral history projects have preserved first-hand accounts from men who went into the water in the dark, uncertain whether rescue would come before exhaustion or sharks did. Those accounts describe a side of this campaign that action reports and doctrine manuals can't capture: the disorientation, the noise, the sheer speed at which a ship could go from intact to sinking. Military historians still point to this campaign as a genuine turning point, not just in who controlled Guadalcanal, but in how the U.S. Navy fought for the rest of the war. It's rarely taught with the same detail as Midway or D-Day, despite costing more ships than almost any other campaign in the Pacific. But the doctrine forged in those 4 brutal months, under fire, with almost no room for error, carried the fleet through everything that came after. Iron Bottom Sound isn't just a graveyard. It's the place where a Navy that went in unprepared came out knowing exactly how to win the fight it hadn't trained for. If this story hit you the way it hit us to research it, do us a favor. Hit like and subscribe to the History Vault 7 for more of the untold battles that shaped this country and this world. These aren't just names in a textbook. They're men who fought in the dark,
against odds nobody wrote down at the time, so the rest of us could inherit the world we live in. Drop a respect in the comments if you remember their sacrifice. We'll see you in the next chapter.